I'm going to introduce Mr. Tim Franklin, who's going to introduce Mr. Robert Ruby, who's our moderator tonight, as for the past several years. If you haven't had a chance to meet Mr. Franklin, of course, he's the new editor since January of the Baltimore Sun and executive vice president. He's a native of Indiana, born there, University of Indiana graduate. He's on the board of the alumni board of the School of Journalism at that institution, and has generously endowed a scholarship in journalism at Indiana. His roots in journalism, to a large extent, were formed in Chicago with the Chicago Tribune for 17 years. He was a reporter there. He served as Metro editor, as sports editor, and as associate managing editor responsible for the business section of the paper. He was editor after that of the Indianapolis Star, then the Orlando Sentinel for 3 years, during which time that paper received 4 or 5 very significant national awards for its journalism. And as I said, since January has been editor of the Baltimore Sun. So it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Tim Franklin.
Good evening. Thanks for that introduction. I appreciate it. I want to applaud and thank all of you for coming out this evening. The Sun is proud to be supporting what we hope will be an enlightening discussion of these volatile times in our world. We are indeed living through turbulent times. The war in Iraq, the struggle to transform Afghanistan into a democracy, the constant threat of terrorism, the continuing strife in the Middle East, and of course the big news of the past couple weeks, abuse at the prison in Iraq. Of course, all of these events are occurring in a world with fewer boundaries. We're seeing the growing importance of economic globalization, and we are seeing a globalization of news coverage as well. The advent of 24-hour cable news, satellite television, and the internet mean that world events are instantly burned into our consciousness as they are happening. What those mediums do not always offer, however, are the context to make sense of world events. And that's literally where the Baltimore Sun shines. It's even more important than ever for newspapers to provide understanding, perspective, and depth. Indeed, that's the goal of the Sun every single day. And that's the goal of our program here this evening. I'm delighted to introduce one of our colleagues who will be our tour guide this evening on the discussion of world events. Robert Ruby has been foreign editor of The Sun since August of 2001, and it's been a busy, important time for his 5 correspondents in Jerusalem, Moscow, Beijing, Johannesburg, and London. He coordinated our coverage of the war in Afghanistan and the American invasion of Iraq. Robert grew up in North Carolina. He studied Romance languages, but despite that, became a newspaper reporter. I guess newspaper work is more romantic. I don't know. As a foreign correspondent for The Sun, beginning in the mid-1980s, he was based in Paris and then in Jerusalem for 9 years, and he's also reported from Africa. He's the author of 2 books, Jericho, about the Middle Eastern city of that name, and Unknown Shore, the story of an early English colony in the Canadian Arctic. He was deputy foreign editor before becoming foreign editor, and his most recent dispatches for the paper have come from Syria and Iran. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Robert Ruby.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you, Frank Bird. Mr. Bird and I were talking a couple of months ago when we first started planning this program and trying to come up with a title for it. It always helps organize everyone's thoughts. The title we chose was A Time of Crisis, Can the United States Get It Right? I've been trying to think of some historical precedents for the situation the United States is in now as an occupying power in Iraq and all the problems that's brought. And there are 2 previous occupations that came to mind that might be able to give us a little bit of guidance as to where things could go in Iraq. One of those occupations began with a speech, and I'd like to read you a very short excerpt from it. Our armies do not come into your cities and lands as conquerors or enemies, but as liberators. You people of Baghdad are to understand that it is not the wish of my government to impose alien institutions upon you. It is the hope of my government that your aspirations shall be realized, and that once again the people of Baghdad shall flourish. I'm commanded to invite you, through your nobles and elders and representatives, to participate in the management of your civil affairs in collaboration with the political representatives of my government who accompany the army, so that you may realize the aspirations of your race. Some of you probably recognize this as the proclamation that was made in 1917 by the British general who was commanding British troops when they took Baghdad during World War I. That was Lieutenant General Sir Stanley Maude, who died a couple months later in Baghdad of cholera. And let me stick with the British experience a little bit longer, because in 1920, 3 years after Maude said the British had come as liberators, there were about 100,000 armed fighters launched an insurrection against the British occupation. These were Sunnis and Shia both. The cities of Najaf and Karbala were in total turmoil, which should sound a little bit familiar. For its response, Great Britain relied primarily on the Royal Air Force. By the time the fighting was over, or seemed to be over, the British casualties were 9 killed, 7 wounded, and 11 aircraft destroyed. The Iraqi casualties were 9,000 dead. But of course, the fighting wasn't over. Great Britain needed someone to run the country. It chose as its ruler a man who became King Faisal, who, as far as I know, had never previously been in the country. He did a pretty good job until his death from natural causes in 1933. He was succeeded by a somewhat less competent son named Ghazal, who ruled until 1939. I think he died in an automobile accident. Ghazal was succeeded by Faisal II. He was an infant, so the country was governed by a regent with a large coterie of advisors. They were very pro-British. They remained that way through World War II, and everything was going more or less okay until the 1950s, when the Iraqi military, was very unhappy about the country's pro-Western stance. So in 1958, Faisal II is a young man in his early 20s. Faisal is killed, the former regent is killed, all the advisors are killed, they're dismembered, they're dragged behind cars. It's another somewhat familiar scene. After a lot more bloodletting and people being hung from light poles, you get to 1968 and the arrival of the Ba'ath. The Ba'ath gives of Saddam Hussein. I think we know the story from Saddam Hussein to the present. I would argue you can draw an almost straight line from the British occupation that began in 1917 to the Ba'ath, to Saddam Hussein, to the current American occupation. There's a second, more recent set of lessons about occupation in the Middle East, and that's the Israeli experience in Gaza. That particular experiment has been going on for 37 years, since 1967. Early on, Israel set up a government very much akin to the Coalition Provisional Authority that's now in Baghdad. But I think in some ways the Israelis actually had a best case situation, because for the first decade or two, they really had pretty much of a free hand. They built a lot of schools, they paved roads, they, for the first time, brought running water to hundreds of thousands of people. Thousands of Palestinians were employed as teachers. Thousands more were employed in good jobs that had not previously been available. And I think we all know the outcome of it. The Palestinians hate the situation. The occupation did not, it turns out, improve the security of Israel. It ultimately failed to improve the lives of the Palestinians. Can the United States get it right? I would say the historical precedents in the region are very grim. My colleagues might think differently. We're about to find out. And I'd like to introduce them. And let me also say how I think the evening's going to go. Each of them is going to speak about 10 minutes, and I'd like all three of them to finish before we spend the rest of the evening, almost as much time as you'd like, up till 7:30, with us trying to answer your questions as best we can. Tom Bowman, who many of you know, is the Sun's Pentagon's correspondent. He wrote extensively about how the war was planned and fought, and more recently about tensions within the Pentagon, and in recent days about events at Abu Ghraib prison. Mark Matthews is the paper's longtime diplomatic correspondent and also used to report from the Middle East. I think he's done tireless, almost heroic reporting on the very difficult issue of policy making vis-a-vis Iraq. Todd Richissin is based in London. During the war, he reported from southern Iraq as well as Baghdad. He's made several trips back to the region. He's also reported on the tensions between Europe and the United States, the travails of Prime Minister Tony Blair, the Madrid train bombings, and just this week also what I thought was a groundbreaking story on the role of the military intelligence units at Abu Ghraib prison. And I'd like to start with Todd. Why don't you stay here?
Good.
I think, yeah.
More comfortable. Good evening. I remember from last year that you guys like to ask a lot of questions, and I like to answer them as well, so I'm going to keep it pretty brief and save as much time as I can for that. I guess my role is to try to answer whether we can get it right with Europe. And so far, the answer has been no, we have not in the past. I think I'm probably a bit more optimistic than Robert is about how we can turn that around and how quickly we might turn that around. But let me give you some indication of what we're up against. This is a two-tier headline that was in one of the London papers on the day that I left. I believe it was Thursday that I flew out. Land of the Free. Underneath the Land of the Free was the picture of the female guard at Abu Ghraib prison with a leash on the Iraqi prisoner. Underneath that was Home of the Brave. Underneath Home of the Brave was the naked Iraqi, terrified as two dogs were barking at him, and which, according to Seymour Hersh, eventually bit him and wounded him fairly badly. Now, I would be willing to bet that that newspaper in London, our closest ally, lost no subscriptions over printing that. You go into France, and you see very similar headlines about the arrogance of the United States. The editorial cartoons are devastating in their portrayal of what America thinks it is and what they think America is. I think if I were to give anybody advice, and I don't think that this administration would take it, it is that as Americans, and probably many of us in this room, including myself, sometimes have a difficulty thinking in ways that are other than American, which does not mean un-American. Consider that there's 5 million Muslims in France. The French people and the French government are going to think a lot differently about the wisdom of going to war against a country that is primarily Muslim than Americans are, who are an ocean away and who do not have that kind of population. The same is true in Germany, which has a substantial Muslim population. Germany has a history that we're all aware of, that we don't have, and its deep reluctance to get into war is understandable. Yet, when we try to gain support for what the United States policies are going to be, ostensibly to combat terrorism, we preach to them from an American point of view, seemingly disinterested or unknowing about what their history is and why they would be so reluctant to get into another war, particularly a war that they see as optional. Going back to what we're up against, consider this, and it's fairly obvious, but I think sometimes we miss the obvious. We are the country that was attacked on September 11th. Pardon me. Yet, there is a substantial part of Europe, and I'm not talking about just the Arab population. There's a substantial part of Europe that is rooting against us in this war, that wants to see the United States fail. Now, when you talk to people at the think tanks, when you talk to politicians, they know that it's not in the interest of Europe for the United States to fail in Iraq. Yet we have kind of given back the sympathy that we gained on 9/11 because of a war that was begun in the minds of many Europeans. And let me stress that again. Everything that I'm saying is, you have to look at it from their point of view. That's my point, is that we probably don't do that often enough. But we gave up the sympathy by starting a war, in their view, that was unnecessary and that was optional. And intellectually, our reasons have fallen down to them. At first, it was because of weapons of mass destruction. Well, we haven't found a weapon of mass destruction. Then it was to get rid of a brutal dictator. We got rid of the brutal dictator, and 3 days after, well, let me stop there. We got rid of the brutal dictator, but Iraq was far from free at that point. There's also a tendency by Americans, I think, to equate democracy and freedom. They are not the same. Very soon we're going to have democracy in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is still not free. You can't travel outside of Kabul with any degree of safety. 3 days after the pictures were shown on CBS, the ones that have caused so much trouble for everybody, George Bush gave a speech that said that the rape cells and the torture chambers of Saddam are over forever. Consider how that plays in Europe. Consider how that plays in the Arab world, when in the same newscast, in the same newspapers, there are further pictures being printed of what happened at Abu Ghraib. Now to the more optimistic point that I said I would get to. It is not the case that you're never going to convince France or Germany or any of the other European countries that what the United States policy is correct. I think it is the case, though, that you have to take into consideration their background. So would France have come along in the Iraq War eventually? The sad fact is we'll never know. But I think from my take on what was going on in France, that if this war was getting underway a year later, after even the very large Muslim population was convinced that, yes, we did try to do absolutely everything short of war, the French may have come along. Would the Germans have come along? At least in a token role, I think they would have. But again, they were not convinced, and I don't think we really tried to convince them very hard that absolutely everything short of war had been done. The easy answer, and I'm not trying to be flip here, but how do we repair things with Europe? Not advocating this in any means in this role that I have. A new president would go a long way. But it would not solve the problem. You consider what's happened with this war and consider what the polls have been and consider how Americans feel about this war, and only recently has support for the war fallen under 50%. Only recently has George Bush's approval ratings for the way he's handled things fallen under 50%. So that would not necessarily solve the problem. After the next election, regardless of who is president, my hope is that if it's George Bush, that he will recognize that there have been some problems made and that we are better off with Europe than without them. And that if John Kerry's elected, that John Kerry will do what he has said that he would do, which is to bring Europe in here to think a little bit more like Europeans, which does not give up our resolve to protect ourselves, but takes a smarter approach, in his view, to bring others in, because in numbers we are stronger than we are alone. That's all. Thanks.
And let me ask Mark Matthews, how can the United States get it right in the larger Middle East, not just Iraq, but the whole region?
Looking out on the whole Middle East landscape right now, Iraq looms very large, but it's just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Iraq itself is a country of 25 million people that does not appear to have a credible leadership, even 6 weeks before the United States is supposed to hand over political power, while keeping tens of thousands of troops in the country. Next door, Iran is working very hard at its nuclear energy program that many people in the United States suspect is going to turn into a nuclear weapons program. Our closest friend in the region, Israel, is watching Iran very nervously while fighting its own war, and it has to be called that, guerrilla war against the Palestinians, which so far has claimed more than 800 Israeli lives and more than 2,300 Palestinian lives. Afghanistan is given over to power by warlords in much of the region outside of Kabul, and it's also resuming its old role as the world's chief producer of opium. The revenue from the opium can find its way to terrorist groups and to international criminals, and even to the Taliban, which is reviving as a guerrilla movement. And throughout the region, and this is really the serious problem that the United States confronts, there is an exploding population of people aged 18 to 30, and they live in countries that have been bypassed by globalization. They don't even have a regional free trade agreement among themselves. And the education in large parts of the region is substandard. Job training is very meager, and the economic prospects for these people, mostly Muslim, intent on starting families, is really very bleak. And this is a population that is ripe for the siren call of extremist groups. And as for those extremist groups, the Al-Qaeda movement has, far from being defeated, has morphed into a collection of loosely knit but very dangerous cells that are using the technology of the internet to their advantage, and as Todd witnessed in Madrid, are capable of immense destruction and killing a lot of innocent people. All these things, each of these things separately, is dangerous for the United States. Together, the mixture appears to be almost apocalyptic. People will debate for years whether war and an invasion of Iraq should have been the United States' first step in trying to solve all these problems. But the picture we were given before the war was that, in fact, the war would set the United States on a path to be able to approach each one of these constructively. Iran would be intimidated. So would the Palestinian militants. Therefore, they would be more willing to make peace. The terrorist groups would become easier to track down. And furthermore, there would be an example of democracy in the Middle East that would cause reform to spread throughout the region. What the Bush administration calls its forward strategy for freedom is off to a very rocky start. It looks as there is now, just in the period since the photos were exposed, there's a humility in the Bush administration that you can feel. There's not only a deep pessimism, but nowadays we hear very little of the hubris and the arrogance that we heard a year ago. One measure of it is the enormous responsibility that they're placing on a 70-year-old man, an Algerian diplomat by the name of Lakhdar Brahimi. It's he who is supposed to put Iraq's government back together, and the United States is basically intent on accepting his recommendation, and he's got an immense job of trying to find members of each of Iraq's ethnic and religious groups who has a credible standing with his or her own population, and can actually lead Iraq away from occupation and towards elections. Another measure of the new humility is the apologies that we never thought we'd hear from anybody in the Bush administration. But still, they appear to be stuck, and an administration that has been at war with itself almost since the very beginning, with Colin Powell representing a very traditional, outward-looking approach of working with other countries and building on international agreements, and the Pentagon hard-charging, believing that American power could begin to solve the region's problems. They've all now circled the wagons and are starting to come together in a common gloom, but they don't appear to have the answers. Todd mentions that Europeans would like a different American president, and I'm sure that's true. John Kerry and Joe Biden constantly offer the prescription of working more closely with Europe, with France and Germany in trying to find a common approach, not only to Iraq, but to the problems of the greater Middle East. But I'm here to tell you, the international community doesn't really have a clue either. This morning I was in a group discussion with a very senior European diplomat, and he didn't have the answers, and said that his own meetings with the discussions with United States officials didn't seem to produce any either. Belatedly, the Bush administration is trying to push forward on two fronts. One is the Israeli-Palestinian problem, and in that respect, they appear to have flip-flopped twice over the past 2 weeks, and each time it kind of damaged the United States in the region. The first time was when Bush, in attempting to help Israeli Prime Minister Sharon regain support from his own party for a withdrawal from the Gaza Strip and part of the West Bank, and endorsed the Israeli plan to keep some settlements in the West Bank and to deny the Palestinians a right of return. The administration was absolutely correct in that this has been previously negotiated and is accepted certainly by officials in the region as reality. But to state it and to appear to be yanking away bargaining chips from the Palestinians did an enormous amount of damage to American prestige in the Arab world, and just increased the feeling that the United States is entirely one-sided, and that's a very important. That conflict is probably more important than Iraq in determining how the Arab and Muslim world feels about the United States. After the pictures were exposed, Bush flip-flopped and tilted towards the Palestinians. This did us damage with the Israelis. They are always very anxious about not being able fully to trust the United States, and they fear that if the chips are ever down for an American president, they could be betrayed. Well, having done that, yesterday, the president, I think quite reluctantly, fulfilled a promise that he'd made to leading members of Congress and imposed sanctions on Syria. Today, one of the reactions we saw from that was that there was a new State Department travel warning about traveling to Syria because it might be dangerous for Americans. This was a form of punishment about which you could probably rightly say, this may hurt me more than it hurts you. With that kind of gloomy survey, I'll follow Todd and suggest a few flickers of light, things to watch that might over time brighten the outlook. But for each one to work, it's going to require an American president to really probe for expertise on the region and not imagine that the U.S. government has all the answers and all the prescriptions. One of the flickers stems from the fact that Iran, despite its nuclear ambitions, has behaved itself very well during our occupation of Iraq. They've adopted a wait-and-see posture and nipped a little bit at the United States, but not done any serious damage, and they could upset that apple cart in a period of weeks if they chose to. All they would have to do is send some of the militant groups that they sponsor, such as Hezbollah, into the country, and the damage to the United States could be quite severe. Another bright spot is that a widespread stirring and eagerness for reform in the Arab world. Many of the populations there detest their own autocratic governments. They believe they themselves have been held back. There is a growing movement among intellectuals and others, educated populations. The numbers are small, but they want to democratize, and that's something that could be built on. And a third bright spot is the fact that in Turkey there is a Muslim government with roots in fundamentalism that remains a close friend of the United States and has maintained a security relationship with Israel. If Turkey is admitted to the European Union, as Germany is inclined to support, I don't think France is yet, then Turkey could very well become the gateway between the West and the Arab world that could open up the region to much freer trade and greater prosperity. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
And Tom Bowman, that leaves to you the very simple problem of how can the United States get it right militarily? You can approach it however you'd like, whether it's infighting within the Pentagon or, more interesting to me, is things on the ground in Iraq. What can and should the United States be doing?
Excuse me for standing, but I've been sitting at my desk all day and then sat in traffic for an hour and a half trying to get up here, so this is a little easier. I want to start out by just throwing out a few statistics that will illustrate, I think, where we are militarily here. And we were told last spring by the Pentagon that by the end of last summer, early fall, there'd be 30,000 US troops in Iraq. And then they changed that. They said, well, actually it's going to be 100,000 through the spring of '07. And some Army officers I talked with at that point said, that will break the Army after the third year. And last week they announced 135,000 troops will stay there through '05, end of next year. That gives you a sense of what we have here now. Now, looking at what's going on the ground, people I talk with say there are distinct problems. Fallujah, they believe, in what we're seeing there is more of a military problem than the Mahdi army. In Fallujah, you have the remnants of Saddam's regime. You have Republican Guard elements. You have terrorists who know what they're doing, who know how to set up interlocking fires, who know how to dig in defenses. It's much more of a threat militarily than the Mahdi army, who are basically a bunch of zealots running around with AK-47s. The Army officers tell me they'll run into the streets and you just mow them down. The Army's actually feeling bad about what they're doing with the Mahdi army. But the larger question here now is what we're seeing now is the military and the political situation is intertwined. Is this becoming more of a political problem than a military problem? Is nationalism starting to take root here? How many Iraqis are saying, we supported the US when they first came, now we don't support them? How many of them are saying, we don't like these terrorists, we don't like the former regime elements, but you know what? We don't like you either. We don't want foreign troops on our soil. That's what we have to watch, I think, now. And I think that's what we're seeing. And it's being exacerbated clearly by Abu Ghraib and the pictures people are seeing. They don't want the United States troops there anymore. And if that's the case, if that starts to grow, it doesn't matter how many troops you send, because you can't turn that around. And I want to just go over quickly some of the missteps that were clearly made that brought us to where we are today. First one being, should you have gone to war in the first place? With the hindsight of a year, what kind of a threat was Saddam to the United States? There are no weapons of mass destruction they found. And they talk about delivery systems, unmanned aerial vehicles that he was developing. They're not going to reach Baltimore. What kind of a threat was he? Was this a mistake from the start? Anybody, any air breather above the age of 7 would realize you could defeat Saddam on the battlefield. The question is, how do you build a country once he's gone? The Pentagon started planning this war more than a year ago. They started planning the occupation around February, January. And one of the things they did was they tossed out a year and a half's worth of work by the State Department, the Iraqi Working Group, because of the tension between the State Department and the Pentagon. They threw it in the trash. We don't need that stuff from the State Department. We know how to run a country. So what did they do? First of all, they didn't listen to their generals. General Shinseki said you need several 100,000 troops. My count is that's probably 300,000 to occupy Iraq. They sent half that. And they said Shinseki was wildly off the mark. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He only ran the Bosnia campaign, peacekeeping. Rumsfeld was a peacetime naval aviator, surrounded by PhDs that never served in uniform. First, and the second thing they did was they fired the Iraqi army. They took 400,000 men with guns and told them to go home with no money, no means of support. They de-Baathified the country that even senior generals now privately will admit was foolhardy. Tens of thousands of people, some clerks, some teachers, were thrown out of their jobs. The infrastructure of the country that they could run, tossed out, with large families, no income. I would guess that some of their children were the ones we saw kicking the corpses in Fallujah. And the other thing that it's a problem in Iraq to this day is the tension between the military and the Coalition Provisional Authority, which one wag at the Pentagon told me the green zone where the CPA works, he calls it Alcatraz without the view. They rarely leave the green zone. Their presence in the country isn't that great. They have people who work in the Bush campaign and have very little experience. Remember, we fired all those State Department types that knew what they were talking about. We didn't need those people. So the military has to deal not only with the security situation in Iraq, they have to rebuild the country as well. Each commander, each division commander in Iraq has what's known as SURF. It's the Commander's Emergency Relief Fund, tens of millions of dollars that they can spend however they wish. There's now an effort to triple that fund because they can spend it more effectively than the CPA, which sits around doing reports and figuring out how to rebuild the country, but they're not moving fast enough. And privately, generals will tell you that. I was told one story about a colonel in a certain section of Iraq. He had a factory, and these folks in the factory weren't paid for several weeks. And he calls the CPA and said, hey, listen, I need some money to pay these folks. And the CPA said, well, what we're doing now, this is a true story, what we're doing now is an analysis of what these folks do at the factory and try to come up with a prevailing wage for that region for what they build. And the colonel said, no, you don't understand. These folks are going to walk, and they'll probably riot. We need money now. The CPA said, we're still working our report. Colonel paid them out of his own funds and was criticized by the CPA. So where are we today? The threat indicators have gone up, the Pentagon has said. It's a more dangerous place. And the Army itself, which as you know has been overstretched here, 90% of the Army's combat infantry battalions have been called up, have served overseas, some repeatedly, since 9/11. 90%. The Army is already starting to feel the effects of all this. There's fraying around the reenlistment rates of Army Reserve and also now active duty units. The Army Reserve reached 96% of its goal for reenlistment, which sounds pretty good, but again, that's their goal. They missed that. And if you look within those figures, it's even worse. If you look at those who reenlisted with prior service, it goes down to 90%. And this is precisely what military officers are worried about. They're starting to lose the career people. The non-commissioned officers, the sergeants, the young lieutenants and captains who are the backbone of the Army, they're starting to leave. And even the 82nd Airborne, which is one of the crack units of the military, their reenlistment is also down about 5%. So we're starting to see the downward trend in reenlistment. And officers are very, very worried about that. Because once you start eroding the Army, it's hard to rebuild it again. And lastly, people I talk with at the Pentagon, people who have been over to Iraq, who have lost friends, dead and wounded, they are almost beside themselves by Abu Ghraib and what happened there. And they feel that the good works that they've done there, building schools and clinics and trying to help the Iraqi people, is all in vain now, that many people in Iraq now will just look for revenge. Thanks.
For questions, what I suggest is if anyone who has a question would come up to the microphone in the two aisles, and I'll just go from side to side and just direct them where I think they should go. And we can start right here, please.
The quick question is, given the theme of this forum and what I've heard so far, the answer must be no. Or can we get this right? The real question is, can we extricate ourselves? If we leave, do we create a bigger problem than if we stay?
My personal view is that it would be far more dangerous to leave than it is to stay, and that's going to be the case whether the next administration is Republican or Democratic. I'm very sobered, however, by a speech that was excerpted in the Sun a couple of weeks ago. It was a speech that Lyndon Johnson gave in, I think, 1964, when he pointed out the number of American casualties in South Vietnam at that time. It was 400 people. And given that enormous number, and given all the strategic issues that seemed to be at stake, surely it was unthinkable to have a withdrawal from South Vietnam. Let me ask Mark.
We can already see that there's diminished expectations for what the United States could possibly achieve in Iraq. The first sign of it was in Fallujah when the U.S. military dropped the idea of trying to track down the killers of the American contractors, and instead have worked out a tense peace with the leaders of the community and tried to get an Iraqi force in there to run the town. There's negotiations going on around the Shiite shrine cities of Najaf and Karbala. Some people think that really is the pattern that we're now going to see, where we try to get Iraqi leaders to take control of a community, get Iraqi security people, however trained they are, to go in there and to keep order, and bit by bit extricate ourselves from the major population centers. Over time, be able to withdraw American troops. That's probably not going to result in anything that approaches Western-style democracy. And in fact, the country could very well pull apart or be such a loose federation that there might be actual Kurdish, Shia, and Sunni governments in different areas. But that's coming to be the best case scenario.
I recently met with Janice Palmer, publisher, president, chief executive of the Sun paper. She looked me in the eye and admittedly said she has liberal leanings. I think it's personified by this panel, who spent a lot of time with the atrocities of the prison in Aruba, comparing it with Alcatraz, but not one of you mentioned the beheading of this young man recently, the beheading of Neil, the Wall Street Journal publisher. Now, my question is weapons of mass destruction. I think the popular belief for years, Clinton administration, Senator Kerry and everybody else said they had them. We put Iraq under an embargo for 11 or 13 years, and all they had to do to get off this embargo was tell us when they destroyed them, how they destroyed them, and where they destroyed them. I haven't seen any mention of that. Now, did they have weapons of mass destruction? And if so, while I know we haven't found them yet, what happened to them?
Can I take a stab at that first? First of all, we did report the incident involving Mr. Berg. It was on our front page today. And secondly, terrorists don't have any standards. The Army does have standards, and there's nobody more upset about this than a lot of Army officers.
And let me mention something that, and then I'll defer to Mark. We're going to get to weapons of mass destruction. I don't think anyone has forgotten about Saddam Hussein's record, which included destroying about 4,000 Kurdish villages, gassing 200, killing about 40,000 marsh Arabs in the south, displacing another 500,000, and after the Gulf War, killing about 300,000 Shiites in the south when there was a rebellion. There really are mass graves there. We're all quite well aware of it. I think that is a separate issue from the weapons of mass destruction. I don't think any of us up here, either last year or now, are saying that that was an attractive or desirable regime for anyone. Mark, why don't you talk about sort of what went right and what went wrong on both the intelligence gathering and the search for weapons of mass destruction?
The intelligence gathering on weapons of mass destruction was very lacking in accurate human intelligence. Everybody involved will say that now. They relied very, very heavily on the work that had been done by UN inspectors, which stopped in 1998. After that, it was really a matter of almost educated guesswork as to what Saddam Hussein's regime had been developing and how much they had stockpiled. The United States didn't know where it was. It had speculation on where it was, and that was it. The UN inspection process was meeting some Iraqi resistance, but not enough to persuade the inspectors that they weren't going to get anywhere. And it looks in hindsight as though the United States cut that process short before anything could be found, or B, there had been enough obstruction by the Iraqis to persuade other countries that war was necessary. And that's really where the situation was left. Now, nobody knows the answer to that. There is some speculation, though, that there was that it was not just a matter of hiding things. That Saddam himself felt that his regime could only survive if there was a perception out there that he had dangerous weapons that he might not have had.
Unfortunately, it's 7:30, and so we'll have to have that be the end of the questioning. This has a very heavy feel tonight, doesn't it? And very seldom have the sessions felt quite this heavy, I think. And hopefully next year, when the panel is held, there'll be more positive vibrations among all of us. I remember as a little boy in 1942 seeing at one of the motion picture theaters Franklin Roosevelt's speech, "We're losing the war." And that struck me as a child. And there are a lot of aspects of this moment which have profound disappointment and negativism to it. But without advocating a course of direction at all, this nation has had a remarkable ability to find its way and to pursue it with a great deal of vigor once it finds it. And certainly we're all hopeful that as we make our way through this very, very difficult circumstance, which our panel, I think, has so ably disclosed, that we'll be, if not successful, at least positive and on the right track. With that, call for a kind of optimism. I'd like to thank the panel. We're always delighted. It's good of them to share both their time and their wisdom with us. And as I said, I profoundly hope that next year when we meet, the 25th session of the panel, the world will look a little better to all of us. Thank you all for coming. It's been a good evening for us.